Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. Well, speaking of feeling the pinch, the third item today is the Yelp antitrust suit that was just filed this week against Google. Would you happen to have
I do have a copy of it. I printed it out.
I discovered I was a footnote in one
you
of
were
this.
a footnote, as was Matt McGee. You're a footnote in there.
Yeah. Well, that
I'm
was a search engine.
disappointed I didn't have a footnote for all these
Well,
years.
that's the geek status symbol. I was a footnote in the antitrust case. No, that was an article on Search Engine Land that I wrote at some point. But so what's striking to me let's talk about what this is first, and then we can sort of do the analysis. So Yelp has sued Google in federal court in Northern California, and the claims, are similar to the case that was just, partially resolved with a negative outcome for Google, finding liability on the antitrust claims in Washington D.C. So it's like abuse of market position and monopoly power, Section 2 of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And then they also have
general search engines and text ads.
Right.
In other words, in the two markets, product markets.
Right.
General search and text
Right.
ads.
And one of the preconditions of antitrust is that you have to define the market that's in question.
Correct.
And then they also include some claims under the California unfair competition statutory provisions, and you're allowed to adjudicate state law claims in federal court, sort of, under certain procedural circumstances. Well, you can do that anyway if there's federal jurisdiction, and there is here because of the Sherman antitrust claims. So
Yelp is also having to define what market they believe that Google has been abusive in.
So significantly, this is the first case that deals explicitly, first U.S.-based lawsuit that deals explicitly with local search, as far as I'm aware.
I think so. And they're defining local search as its own unique product, one which Google has failed at miserably and which they've stolen.
According to Yelp.
According to this thing. But it is a unique product with unique needs, unique content, unique architecture and structure, unique infrastructure, and as such deserves to be considered as a market, a market adjacent to general search.
Right.
And they're also arguing that local search advertising is
unique,
equally unique product market.
Yeah. So I think that so interestingly in Europe, and you and David are closer to this than I am. In Europe, Google has argued that local search should not be subject to DMA compliance, Digital Markets Act compliance, because it's a part of the core search experience. Correct. And proposition. It's deeply integrated into Google's core search algorithm and search functionality.
So a judicial decision in favor of Yelp, and in this this definition is true, would, I think, impact Google's standing in Europe as well.
Yes.
So Google has a lot riding on this case.
Yes.
Because they're going to fight this definition. They're going to say, like they do.
This is not an independent market.
Right.
Yeah.
But Yelp lays out in great detail how it is totally unique. The content is unique. The infrastructure is unique. The graphs are unique. All of it is unique. And Google sort of bolted it onto their general search to gain this competitive advantage in local search because they were failing in their own efforts. So the only way they could succeed was through pushing their one box to the top of the results. Well, Google calls the one box what we refer to as the 3-pack, but Yelp calls it a one box.
Yelp is going after Google's algorithm and SERP, the way that the SERP is structured, and arguably the algorithm, and they're saying, echoing the language of the European regulators, that this is self-preferencing and Google is acting as a gatekeeper, and Google has sought to perpetuate its dominance by actively suppressing or taking action against Yelp and presumably others in the same in the same category. Um,
and they've done so with eye-catching graphics, and like we've seen in local service ads as well as
right,
local, just with eye candy pictures, review stars, and
right.
thus pushing Yelp down the page, minimizing their
Right.
ability to achieve scale, etc.
And we know from our near media research, user testing and research, that people do really respond to these features. I mean, certainly LSAs, when they're present, people really react to them, respond to them, click them, engage with them, and the same has historically been true with the local pack. That the local pack far and away, dominates the engagement in a local SERP. Um,
In
you know,
certain categories.
it more in certain categories more than others. It's not uniform.
Right.
It's not across the board. But in the absence of, if the results were presented differently, less visually compelling, there would be less engagement probably.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Yelp contends that those embellishments drive traffic towards
Right.
Google's local products to the detriment of the local ecosystem.
So there are a number of things that are really interesting about this. One of which is the timing of it. I think had Yelp filed this action a couple of years ago, it would have been a sure loser probably a few years ago. I mean, Yelp details the history of sort of antitrust enforcement and claims against Google in the complaint. And so Yelp is going to benefit from the cumulative legal and cultural impact of that. The Europeans, the FTC, the DC Circuit case recently, which found against Google, as we mentioned. Yelp is going to draft or ride the coattails of those things, and this action has a lot more credibility now, legally and kind of culturally. Previously this would have been seen as sour grapes by a competitor who's losing to Google, who has, I think generally speaking, most people would agree, Google's local graph and review corpus is stronger than Yelp's, even though Yelp is, arguing the opposite. And this just would have been seen as sour grapes, or, you can't compete in the market, so you're turning to
add to the cases that Yelp is referencing. I think the Epic case against Google is another one,
right.
Similar to this, in that the egotistical CEO went after Google, and Apple lost with Apple, but won with Google. So it's being done in that greater context. I agree, but it has some of that same element of egotistical CEO finally getting his opportunity and striking while the iron's hot, to make his point. Because half of this document is how great Yelp is.
Well, of course, right? The Yelp is superior to Google, and there's a kind of smug dimension to the language of the complaint, drafted, of course, by lawyers at the direction of Yelp, but there is a kind of attitude that's certainly there. So way back in 2009, I think it was, Google tried to buy Yelp for $500 million.
And they in the document, they point out that internal documents from that time indicate that Google felt they were failing to attract enough attention, reviews and business engagement, the two elements that Yelp says are the critical definers of local search, specialized vertical search product, right? Like Yelp are those two things.
SVP,
right.
That's an acronym that they use in the complaint. But
specialized vertical product, that's what?
I think that's what they call. I think that's what they called it.
I actually underlined it because it's like such a weird acronym.
Well, they created it for this complaint.
Specialized vertical providers is what it is.
Providers.
Okay.
So, the 2009 Google and Yelp negotiated for an acquisition. For whatever happened, Google didn't offer enough money, or there were some personal issues, whatever it was. Yelp declined to be acquired for $500 million, which is a lot of money, obviously. And they were going after Yelp's review corpus. That's what they wanted, because I don't remember what the status of their own review body of reviews was at the time, but it was certainly much weaker than Yelp, and it had less depth. It was often anonymous and just star ratings. and that failed takeover attempt led directly to Google's acquisition of Zagat ratings, which
Well,
was
firstly, it led to Google, doubling down on reviews
yeah.
themselves, and Yelp claims in this thing that they also stole third-party reviews and showed them as their own in that
Well,
Google
what
Places
they were
display.
doing, if I remember correctly, what they were doing is that they were saying they were showing Yelp reviews on in the
Google
profiles, I believe.
Places profile,
Right,
right?
right. And they were telling Yelp, and Yelp objected to this and said, we don't want you to use our content. And Google said, well, the only way for that to happen is if we de-index it,
Right.
right? So they
Which
used
the
their
FTC then said was the staff in a memorandum said was illegal abuse of power
right,
at the time.
right, and I think very clearly that was, and Google has taken that position before with other parties. Is that well, we can't do what you want unless we completely remove you from the index, and that's kind of a blackmail position. So anyway, so there's this whole long history between the companies, and Yelp has been a tireless lobbyist, anti-Google lobbyist. Back in 2013, 2014, when there was a settlement on the table in a kind of shopping search antitrust context, and I think it included other areas, maybe local as well, maps. Um, there was this idea that Google was going to put the so-called rival links, as they have done with various carousels, and they're doing today with the Places sites carousel in Europe. We're gonna feature other companies, and that should address the antitrust issues. And Yelp essentially killed that deal to protect them from immunize them against further claims through lobbying. And they have also lobbied very, very aggressively in the U.S. against Google, and so they have been instrumental, not solely responsible, but instrumental in the actions that have come and changing the narrative. The Google is not just a better, more innovative competitor, but Google is actually a monopoly that is abusing its power, and that's been going on
Who
for
actually has a less innovative product and relies on
right.
bling to get traffic. Now you started to go, so 2010, all this was happening with Yelp and Google. 2011, when Mayor became the head of local, sort of demoted it, she then bought Zagat for the content and for the rating system, which failed miserably. Google then rolled reviews into Google Plus, which failed miserably. And then, though, 2015, Google started really taking off. They reduced the requirements to leave a review, and they engaged local guides. So,
Well, right, and that was local guides was the real watershed moment for them, because that's where a majority of
well,
the
and
reviews come from.
easing the requirements to leave a review. You no longer
Right.
needed to have an identity to leave a review.
Right.
Google
So they
was
created a whole sort of incentive system for local guides, point system, and perks, and all of that. And local guides, Sochi did this research a year or two ago that the majority of reviews are left by local guides. It's not
well,
ninety
right. To
percent.
become a local guide, though, you have to have two fingers and a keyboard. I mean, it doesn't
Well,
require a
it's
lot
true.
of
It's
humanity.
true.
You don't even need, you don't need most bodily parts to become a local guide. I mean, it is a very low bar. You leave
Well,
two
but
reviews, you become a local
but
guide.
but it is a system that creates incentives for people to participate, which has been
Yes,
very, very successful.
particularly at the high end where people leave thousands of reviews. Yes,
Right.
I agree.
And that local guide system is modeled explicitly, not they don't acknowledge this, but it's basically the Yelp Elite Squad. They basically ripped off the idea of the Yelp Elite Squad.
Although at scale with gamification and the sort of lottery to get the benefits, right? We're going to select, 1 in 100 local guides to come to a conference, and you have to have 10 gazillion points to be eligible, and then you're going to put your hat in the lottery, and maybe you'll get to come to
Well, right, and
two
it's from a certain perspective, it's very smart. It's a very well executed system that has been incredibly effective
right?
for Google.
So the net result is Google has dominated reviews for the last 8 or 9
Well, and they have like
years.
at least 10x what Yelp has in terms of
Right.
review volume.
Exactly.
Right.
So, what the question with the Yelp, firstly, is will they succeed at defining local search and local search advertising as unique markets?
I think
And
that's
if
that's where the real vulnerability for the Yelp complaint lies, I think.
The other vulnerability, as I read it, was they claim that, I don't know, such a very high percentage comes from spot one on the search results, and Google always advertises there or puts, dominates the local results there.
High
And
percentage of what, clicks?
of clicks
Yeah.
come from that. And I think that data that they're using is flawed. I think that, in local, I don't think we've seen that that's not the case historically. Like it may be, I think it is the case overall in general search because there's so many informational queries and so on that the first spot is dominant. But I think in local, I don't think that's the case, that Google can drive that traffic wherever they want. And so I think that they're vulnerable a little bit on the facts as well as on whether or not these are actual markets. Now, I think they are markets. I've always thought it. And, when we went to Europe and heard Google define local as part of general search, we found that disingenuous. And so it'll be interesting to see how the court decides in that.
Well, right, and I think that's where the complaint could fail. If they get over that hurdle, I think they win on at least some of these claims, given the history and given the recent DC Circuit decision.
Correct.
And I think that will be super interesting. They are now engaged in another antitrust case around ad tech. Right, they just lost. It is yet to be, the remedies have yet to be determined, and there's of course an appeal process that will happen. But they just lost on the antitrust claims in DC. They have another case that's starting around ad tech in particular, not advertising itself, but the stack. Although I'm less familiar with all the particular claims there, and they just apparently had a very, very bad day in court the other day, where they have a very aggressive policy internally where they delete a lot of their internal communications or try and avoid. There's a sort of a document preservation rule. And Google has been accused of deleting things that were showed some sort of culpability or some sort of what a sort of conspiratorial behavior or whatever. And the court sort of lambasted them for some of that and said, there are going to be consequences for this. I'm going to draw inferences. I may rule, adverse to you on the basis of this behavior. Then that's sort of rolls up to Kent Walker, who I don't know if I think he's the general counsel. But it's looking kind of bad for Google on a number of different legal fronts. They've got all the European stuff. They've got Yelp now. They've got the remedies phase of the DC trial. They've got this second antitrust case. And so there's sort of blood in the water. I think that's what's going on with Yelp, is that Yelp sort of seized its moment, recognizing that it had some momentum given the earlier finding of liability. And I do think that the government will successfully argue for the breakup of at least certain components of Google. I do think there is going to be an order for divestiture. We'll see what I don't think the court will say, well, we're going to just simply earn in those default search agreements and then let them be done with it. I don't think the government will say that's an insufficient remedy, will not address the competitive issues in the market fully. And so you need to break apart these, get rid of Chrome, break Android off, whatever it is, share data, make the search data available to rivals.
I think that's one of the things that Yelp is asking for, is shared data.
Yeah.
In their resolution. One sort of thing we haven't talked about is the fact that we are coming to a transition of administration. And from an executive point of view, the administration is very influential in defining antitrust policy. I mean, it's taken almost 4 years for the DOJ and the FTC to have they failed a lot initially in their antitrust efforts. They had to learn what it took because they're going back to old doctrine that hadn't been recently tried. So they had to develop a number of new arguments to be successful. And we run the danger that whoever wins is going to be less supportive of antitrust. Obviously, Silicon Valley is putting a lot of money into both sides. Crypto's putting a lot of money into both sides, with the hope that whoever comes into power is more favorable towards big tech, not just tech.
Right,
and there is it's interesting to me that this was filed, 2 months before the election, right?
Well,
Then
there
it's
is
sort
a
of on the
precedent.
record.
There is a precedent for it in the sense that Microsoft, we talked about this before. In 1999, the judge said, "Hey, we got to break Microsoft up into two or three companies," and ultimately, the U.S. government, after the George W. Bush election in 2000, ultimately they settled, and nothing
Right.
happened really to Microsoft. It was sort of a slap on the wrist scenario. So that's a very real thing, very real possibility.
And this current DOJ case that was just decided in the government's favor was actually first filed under Donald Trump.
Under Trump, yeah, that's
Under
right.
Trump. So I mean, but it has the ability to impact sort of overarching environment that we've described here of the blood in the water and the sort of
Well, and I mean
frenzy around Google.
the irony is that antitrust case, it did have an impact. I think it did have an impact. The Microsoft case, the earlier case in 99 2000. But what really happened to Microsoft was that Google sort of showed up, and Apple to some degree with mobile, and those competitive forces were the thing that kind of put Microsoft, you know
Back on its heels.
yeah, even though the company is more valuable today than it was back in those days, it was competition in the market that really did Microsoft in, and eliminated the monopoly condition, the browser monopoly, and other things that was going on at that time. And now what you've got by analogy is you've got OpenAI, and you've got the AI phenomenon that's happening. That does not so far appear to be any kind of a threat to Google's search monopoly, but over time we'll see what happens. It's very analogous. There's a sort of a sea change afoot in terms of how AI tools are starting to permeate and percolate, and we'll see if that represents the competitive force that's analogous to Google and Microsoft. But it's unclear right now. And Rand
Well,
Fishkin would say it's not having an impact on Google, and it's not going to impact Google. But I am less convinced of that based on my own focus group of one in my own behavior.
I have another 23 pages to read. So I
Okay, well, you can do that right now after we end this podcast. Yeah, I as somebody who did litigation, as a lawyer for almost a decade, I read a lot of complaints. It's just boring as shit. Sometimes it's interesting. Well, you have to appreciate a well-written complaint, and what a complaint is storytelling. Complaint
Right.
is storytelling, and the preamble, the recitation of facts that you get at the beginning of the complaint is the most interesting part, and that's a story. They're creating a narrative that you're supposed to follow into the sort of causes of action that
Right.
follow.
One part of the story was they used Google Gemini AI to make their point. I find that very risky. In other words, Gemini AI, even Google's Gemini AI said that half of all searches are
Oh,
local.
yeah, but you know what? Yeah, yeah. The AI, that's a hallucination. See, my position has always been. I mean, that Google. There's that comment. This has always been a debate. How much search is local? How much search carries a local intent? Google said it's a third, or there's been all kinds of numbers over the years. 20%, a third, 40%. At one point, I think Marissa Mayer said it was 40%. And then there was an internal conference, and Barry Schwartz reported on this. This was double hearsay that it was Googler said it was 46%, but they didn't talk about whether that was mobile or desktop. My position has always been, if you look at the transaction, right, local is sort of uniquely transactional among search categories, or maybe not uniquely, but it's highly transactional. If you look at the transaction, and you count the transaction as a reflection of intent, where the transaction happens ultimately. So if I look for refrigerator, that's not going to count as a local search. But if I buy a refrigerator offline based on my online research, that I would argue that probably carried a local intent, and that's a much bigger percentage of the pie than not.
So Yelp goes with 46% of all Google searches.
Right. That's the Barry Schwartz number that he picked up from a
and
double hearsay.
Then they say that given that Google performs 9 billion searches per day, of which 27% come from the U.S., means that Google performs over 1.1 billion local searches in the US every day.
Yep.
And when they asked Gemini AI, what is Google's market share for local search? Gemini AI said, Google dominates the local search market with as much as 90% of market share. But they also said that in 2022, Google's share of local business reviews had grown to 73% as compared to Yelp's at 6%.
Yeah, there's all kinds of third-party data on the percentage of local reviews that Google controls. I think Bright Local has some data on that as well. I may not be remembering that correctly. Anyway, we're running a little bit longer than normal. That's an interesting discussion. Fascinating to see what's gonna happen. And
we live in interesting times.
Yes, we do. We certainly do. And so we will be back probably not next week, or I won't be back next week because I'm on vacation, but David and Mike may be back next week, or we may do an encore episode. But we will be back soon to talk more about all these fascinating developments in the world of local commerce and local search and Google.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.